And it seems like, at least from what I remember, it didn't really affect anyone outside of the United States. So, you know, the NES, the ET stuff, the Atari stuff, that obviously really impacted the US. But for the rest of the world, it didn't seem like it was really that important or that big of a thing.
Yeah, it wasn't felt. I do have to recognize that being born in 1980, I don't really remember the video game.
Yeah.
I remember having the Amstrad CPC 464 and then going directly to an NES. And the video game scene had not really died in terms of that. You just changed the form factor of how you used to play games. And the first game I ever beat in my life was Magic Land Dizzy. Dizzy, the little egg?
Yeah. Codemasters.
On the old CRT green screen. And then I went directly onto a Nintendo. And by that point, Nintendo had already kind of made a name for themselves and stuff. So it was seamless. Yeah. So I do agree with you, in that it must have been something that is very US-centric. Except, what was the first game you ever beat?
The first game I ever beat was probably something on the Commodore 64, believe it or not. It was probably a really bad arcade conversion. Something along the lines of, pole position, or just something really, really old. But let's say a game console. What's the first game I beat on a game console? It was Super Mario Brothers on the NES. I mean, let's be honest. When I first got that game, I just couldn't put it down. And I remember when I got a Super NES a little bit later on, at the time, I beat every single game I bought because I ended up buying one game every few months because they were very expensive at the time, especially for myself, a poor, college student at the time. I could only really afford maybe one game every 2 months. So I just kind of saved up enough to make sure I got a game that I really liked. And when I got the game, I played the hell out of it. And, I made sure I beat it at least 5 or 6 times. But yeah, NES, Mario World, Mario Brothers, Mario World on the Super NES was probably my first games that I ever beat.
Yeah. Mario 3, oh man, that game is such a good game. Even back then as a kid, I was like, Mario 3 is something special. And I knew that Mario 2 was not a real Mario game.
Mm-hmm.
And the story behind that, was it Doki Doki something or other?
Doki Doki Panic.
Yeah. What would they class that as nowadays then? Because it's literally another game that has been ported as another IP. Maybe that would have its own specification or classification now.
I don't know what you would call that.
Yeah.
But one thing that was interesting was back in the 80s and the 90s, there were on various computers like the Commodore 64, the Amiga, there were various ports of arcade games that had a separate British and a separate US release. So a great example, there's two that come to mind. On the Commodore 64, there was a port of Double Dragon that was done by a British company. I think it was Melbourne House. And there was also a port of the same Double Dragon done by an American studio. That sounds really crazy to think about, right? There was 2 different ports of the same game by different studios, but it was a thing. And one of them was, I think the British one was terrible. It didn't run very well, but the US one was pretty good. On the flip side, there was a port of, I think it was Afterburner on the Amiga, the Sega Superscaler game from the arcades, and it had a US port and a British port, and again, they were done by completely different teams, but exactly the same game. And sometimes, depending on the region, the game would be called something else as well, just to kind of add more complexity to the whole thing. So I don't know what you would call Doki Doki Panic. It's probably just another iteration of the same game. I don't know what you'd call it, but it wasn't really that uncommon, I guess, for back in those days, for different studios to make the same game, make their own interpretation of the game, which is crazy to think about. these days.
I know, yeah. Medium's probably sitting there. He's a little younger than you and I, so he's probably sitting there thinking, it's a bloody Commodore, whatever. Original. No, I don't remember these days.
Yeah. It's one of the emulators I've come up against trying to get Project Firestart running, so I'll be running into that retroactively. The museum fashion soon enough, so I'll try and educate myself.
But it does take us, now that we're talking about older games, it does take us into game preservation.
Well, there's actually something that came to my attention today. I had a friend who's a Bionicle fiend. You remember those little action figures there, the Legos?
Yeah.
Well, they had a fan project called the Bionicle Mask of Power. And supposedly today was sort of like the death knell for that project. Lego got wind of it and eventually put the ban hammer down like, hey, this is good, but, that's interesting, but we're not interested. That kind of thing. So that's apparently gone the way of the dinosaur. Are there any projects or teams that you've seen in the modding scene over the years that, or even that are, ensuing projects that are coming to fruition that you feel have been underrated or kind of gotten under the radar that you'd like to highlight or that have made an impression on you?
I need to be very careful about what I say because sometimes when I kind of signal boost a team, it kind of, and I've actually gotten into trouble doing this in the past. Wow. But that's not to say that there isn't any out there. There's definitely some that I think do great work. And look, for me, I'm really big on what's going on right now with the N64. I don't know if you guys have been following the recompilation, recompiled stuff that's going on. So there's been this really cool thing that's happened, initiative over probably the last 2 years, at least from a public release standpoint. And I can definitely talk about this. This has been very well documented everywhere. But rather than just emulating N64 games on an emulator, which means it still looks blurry, it still looks blocky, it still runs at 15 frames per second. There's a recompilation initiative where basically it's taking the original ROM of an N64 game and it's being able to run on a PC and takes advantage of, again, 60 frames per second, widescreen, enhanced textures, dual analog sticks, and under the covers, there's a lot of complexity that happens. But in general, it really makes it opens up a path for these old N64 games to run on modern PCs. But we kind of touched on that before. But the interesting part of this initiative is that there's also the ability to add mods to these, to these recompilations. So one of the things I've seen recently is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask got a recompilation. And if you just kind of play with the recompilation itself, again, it's just an enhanced version of Majora's Mask. But it still has, again, low-res textures and all that stuff. You can sharpen them up on a 4K display, but it's still going to look very blurry, right? So there are teams of people that have gone in to basically enhance every single texture individually, kind of just hand recreate each of these textures from the button icons, to the overworld map. So doing that obviously takes a lot of care and attention and a lot of time, but it can really transform the game to something that looks completely different, but it's still very familiar, right? So I think that aspect right now is the most exciting part of what we're seeing. And again, that's something that potentially, Nintendo could look at and say, no, you're changing our brand stuff way too much, and we don't like that. And they've definitely done that in the past. But for me, I think the whole initiative of enhancing old games, enhancing them way beyond what they ever originally intended to look like. So it's more of it's more than a remaster at that point, right? Like you're adding so much more to it. Is really interesting to me. So